In 1940, a German admiral reportedly told Hitler, "The Americans, they know how to build fridges and razor blades. They don't know how to build war machines." He was right. At the start of World War II, the United States Army Air Corps was smaller than Romania's. Their fighters were obsolete. Their pilots were few. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies over Europe, and the Japanese Zero was dancing circles around everything in the Pacific. But the Axis powers made one fatal mistake. They looked at America and saw a bank. They didn't tiles, they were looking at a factory. When the sleeping giant woke up, it didn't just fight back. It turned the entire continent of North America into a massive assembly line. Ford stopped making cars and started making B-24 bombers, one every 63 minutes. General Motors stopped making Chevrolets and started making Wildcat fighters. Today, on the War Arsenal, we are looking at the result of that industrial anger. We are unlocking the hangar doors to every single U.S. aircraft of World War II. We will see the P-51 Mustang, the plane that literally strangled the Luftwaffe. We will see the B-29 Flying Fortress, the legend that came home even when half of it was shot away. We will see the F-4U Corsair, the whistling death that terrified the Japanese. And we will see the unsung heroes, the cargo planes and trainers that actually made victory possible. This isn't just a story about wings and propellers. This is the story of how Detroit crushed Berlin and Tokyo from 30,000 feet. You are watching the War Arsenal. If you want to see how the arsenal of democracy took flight, smash that subscribe button. Clear prop. Let's fly. Chapter 1, The Fighters' Struggle to Supremacy. Let's start with the fighters. But before we get to the legends, we have to talk about the struggle. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. When you see a WWII plane with a shark mouth painted on the nose, this is the one. In 1941, this was the best America had. Was it great? No. It couldn't climb as high as a German Bf-10 died. It wasn't as agile as a Japanese Zero. But it was tough. It was available, and in the hands of the Flying Tigers in China, it proved that American tactics, dive, shoot, run, could bleed the enemy. It held the line when nothing else could. Then, the oddball. The Bell P-39 era Cobra. Look at this thing. The engine isn't in the front, it's behind the pilot, like a Ferrari. This allowed them to put a massive 37mm cannon right through the propeller hub. The Americans and British hated it. It had no turbocharger. So above 15,000 feet it was a sitting duck. But you know who loved it? The Soviets. Under Lend-Lease, we sent thousands to Russia. At low altitudes on the Eastern Front, that 37mm cannon popped German tanks like soda cans. The Russians called it the Iron Dog. Now, let's get serious. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The fork-tailed Dell. 2 engines, twin booms, and all the guns concentrated in the nose. No convergence issues. This was the first American fighter to truly scare the enemy. It was fast, it had long range, and it ruled the Pacific. The top 2 American aces of all time, Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire, flew this machine. It was the plane that hunted down Admiral Yamamoto. It was complex, expensive, and devastating. But if you want brute force, you want the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, or a milk jug depending on who you ask. This wasn't a fighter, it was a tank with wings. It weighed 7 tons fully loaded. That's twice as heavy as a Spitfire. It had a massive R-2800 double Wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower, and 8 .50 caliber machine guns. German pilots famously said, "If you shoot a P-47, it just gets angry." It could dive faster than the speed of sound almost, And when it hit a train or a tank convoy on the ground, nothing survived. It was the sledgehammer of the U.S. Army Air Forces. And then, the legend. The North American P-51 Mustang. Specifically, the P-51D. This is the Cadillac of the skies. Originally, it was a mediocre plane with an American Allison engine. Then, the British said, "Hey, why don't you put a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in it?" That changed history. Suddenly, the Mustang could fly high. It could fly fast, 440 miles per hour. But most importantly, it could fly far. With drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, famously said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." It wasn't just a plane, it was the angel of death for the German Air Force. Chapter 2. The Navy's War. Pacific Carriers. While the Army was fighting over Europe, the Navy was fighting a knife fight in the Pacific. No runways, just a floating deck and thousands of miles of water. First up, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. In 1942, this little tubby plane was the only thing standing between the Japanese Navy and Hawaii. Technically, the Japanese Zero was superior. It could turn tighter and climb faster. But the Wildcat was built like a Grumman Iron Works product. It could take punishment. Pilots like John Thack invented the Thack Weave, a tactic where two Wildcats would cover each other's tails. They held the line at Coral Sea and Midway. But America doesn't just hold the line. It pushes back. Enter the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. If the Wildcat was a bulldog, the Hellcat was a pit bull. It looked similar, but it had the massive 2,000 HP engine. It was faster than the Zero. It could climb with the Zero, and it slaughtered them. The Hellcat has the highest kill ratio of any naval fighter in history, 19-1. In the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcat pilots shot down over 300 Japanese planes in one day. It was absolute dominance. And then, the pirate, the Vought F-4U Corsair. Just look at it. The gull wing design. The nose that goes on forever. This plane was built around the biggest engine they could find. The Japanese called it Whistling Death because of the sound the air made over the oil coolers. It was so fast, over 400 miles per hour, and difficult to land on carriers because you couldn't see over the nose, that the Marines took it first and used it from island bases. It became the icon of the Pacific.
Black Sheep Squadron.
Corsair. The terror of Okinawa, Corsair. It was arguably the best piston engine fighter of the entire war. Chapter 3. The Strategic Hammer. The bombers. Fighters win battles. Bombers win wars. The American doctrine was simple. Precision daylight bombing. We will fly over your factories in broad daylight and destroy them. To do that, you need the Boeing B-29 Flying Fortress. This is the icon. 4 Engards, 10 crew members, and 13 machine guns pointing in every direction. It wasn't the fastest, it didn't carry the biggest bomb load, about 4,000, 6,000 plebs on long missions. But my God, was it tough. There are photos of B-17s coming home with the entire nose blown off, with one wing shredded, with 200 flak holes. If you were a crewman, you loved the B-17 because it brought you home. But the other guy did the heavy lifting. The consolidated B-24 Liberator. It was ugly. It was boxy. The crews called it the flying boxcar. It was harder to fly than the B-17, and if it got hit in the wing, Davis wing, it tended to fold up and crash. It flew faster, farther, and carried more bombs than the B-17. We built 18,500 of them. It is the most produced bomber in history. It fought everywhere, Europe, the Pacific, hunting U-boats in the Atlantic. It was the blue-collar worker of the sky. For tactical work, we had the North American B-25 Mitchell. This is the plane Jimmy Doolittle used to raid Tokyo in 1942, launching from an aircraft carrier. It was a medium bomber, but the Americans turned it into a gunship. They put a 75mm cannon, a tank gun, in the nose of the B. It terrorized Japanese shipping. And the Martin B-26 Marauder. At first they called it the Widowmaker because the wings were too small and pilots kept crashing on landing. But once they figured out how to fly it, it became the safest bomber of the war with the lowest loss rate. It was fast and deadly accurate. We also can't forget the attackers. The Douglas A-20 Havoc and the A-26 Invader. These were fast, low-level brawlers. The A-26 was so good it served in Korea, Vietnam, and even in the Congo in the 1960s. It was built like a tank and flew like a sports car. Let's pause for a second. I want you to understand the scale of what we are talking about. Germany built great planes, but they built them like craftsmen. America built planes like they built toasters. At the peak of the war, the Ford Willow Run plant was producing one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Let that sink in. In the time it takes you watch 2 episodes of this show. America has built a 4-engine heavy bomber. Quantity has a quality all its own. Chapter 4. The naval bombers sinking the rising sun. Back to the ocean. If you want to kill an aircraft carrier, you need a dive bomber. The Douglas SBD Dauntless. Slow but deadly. It was old. It was slow. But at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, one squadron of SBDs changed the course of history in 5 minutes. They sank 4 Japanese carriers. It used Swiss cheese dive flaps to stabilize its dive. It was the hero of the Pacific. It was replaced by the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. Pilots hated it. They called it the Beast, or Son of a Bitch Second Class, SB-2C. It was big, heavy, and hard to handle, but it carried a massive payload and hammered the Japanese fleet in 1944 and 1945. And the torpedo bombers. The tragedy of the Douglas TB Devastator. At Midway, almost every single TBD launched was shot down without scoring a hit. It was obsolete and a death trap for its crews. But it was replaced by the Grumman TBF Avenger, the Turkey. This was a beast. It looked like a flying brick. It carried a 2,000 Lebdarp torpedo or bombs. It was so tough it survived the rest of the war as the standard torpedo bomber. Fun fact, a young pilot named George H.W. Bush, future president, was shot down flying an Avenger. Chapter 5, Eyes and Night. The war didn't stop at night. Enter the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. This thing looks evil. It was the first American plane designed from scratch as a night fighter. It had radar in the nose, top secret tech back then, and a remote-controlled turret on top. It hunted in the dark, killing German bombers and V-1 buzz bombs. And the saviors. The consolidated PBY Catalina. The flying boat. It was slow, so slow crews used calendars instead of stopwatches to measure flight time. But it could fly for 15 hours. It found the Bismarck. It found the Japanese fleet at Midway, and most importantly, the Dumbo missions. If a pilot was shot down in the ocean, the Catalina would land in enemy waters to pick him up. For thousands of sailors and airmen, the PBY was the most beautiful plane in the world. We also had the float planes launched from battleships, like the Vought S-2U Kingfisher and Curtiss SOC Seagull. The eyes of the fleet. Spotting for the big guns. Chapter 6. The real winners. Logistics in training. Generals like to talk about bombers, but logistics officers know the truth. The plane that won the war wasn't the Mustang or the B-17. It was the Douglas C-47 Skytrain Dakota. It was a militarized DC-3 airliner. It dropped the 101st and 82nd Airborne into Normandy. It flew the Hump, the most dangerous air route in the world, over the Himalayas to keep China in the war. It carried ammo, food, jeeps, and wounded soldiers. Dwight D. Eisenhower named it one of the 4 weapons of victory, along with the jeep, the bazooka, and the atomic bomb. It is practically immortal. Some are still flying today. There was also the Curtiss C-46 Commando, the muscular brother that carried even more cargo over the mountains. And the gliders, specifically the Waco CG-4, made of wood and fabric. No engine, one-way ticket. They towed them behind C-47s and cut the rope over enemy territory. Dangerous? Insanely. But it put jeeps and artillery right on the front line. And how do you train 100,000 pilots in 3 years? With the North American T-6 Texan Harvard and the biplane Boeing Stearman PT-17. Every single ace, every single bomber commander started here. These sturdy little planes taught a generation how to fly. Chapter 7, The Atomic End. By 1944, the U.S. was looking at the end game. The distances in the Pacific were vast. They needed a bomber that could fly from an island, hit Japan, and come back. They built the most expensive weapons project of the war. Yes, more expensive than the atomic bomb project. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Pressurized cabins so the crew could wear t-shirts instead of fleece suits. Remote-controlled machine guns aimed by computers. It flew too high for Japanese fighters to reach. It firebombed Tokyo. And in August 1945, the Enola Gay and Bockscar dropped the atomic bombs. The B-29 didn't just end the war. It changed the definition of warfare forever. Wings of democracy. So looking back at this massive inventory, what do we see? We see evolution. America started with the P-40 and the Wildcat planes that were good enough to hold the line. But within 3 years, they were building the P-51, the B-29, and the jet-powered P-80, which just missed the war. It was a triumph of engineering, yes, but mostly it was a triumph of industry. Detroit didn't just build planes, they built an overwhelming air force that blotted out the sun. They overwhelmed the Axis, not just with skill, but with sheer, unstoppable numbers. The arsenal of democracy promised to deliver. And the wings of the U.S. Army Air Force delivered victory. We've seen the American muscle. But on the other side of the Atlantic, German engineers were working on something else. Strange shapes, rocket engines, jets that flew without propellers. They were too little, too late, but they invented the future. Next time, we unlock the secrets of the Luftwaffe. From the screaming Stuka to the world's first jet fighter. You don't want to miss that. This is the War Arsenal. Signing off.